a famine strikes a small farming settlement in ancient Mesopotamia, and yet, just a few miles away, granaries sit stocked with enough golden grain to feed thousands for months. The smell of dust and dry chaff hangs in the air as workers seal clay storage pits against the coming winter. Somehow, a wild grass that once grew scattered across hillsides has become the difference between a village starving and a village surviving. But this story really starts over 10,000 years earlier, in the rocky hill country of the Fertile Crescent, where humans hadn't yet learned to farm at all. Long before cities, before writing, before anyone had a word for agriculture, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved across the hills of what's now southeastern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. This region, often called the Fertile Crescent, was home to a wild grassnists now call einkorn wheat, along with a related wild grass, wild emmer. These grasses grew naturally on hillsides, their seed heads bending in the wind, unassuming and easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. Nobody wandering those hills around 9600 BC could have imagined that this modest grain would end up feeding more people in more places than almost any other plant in human history. For generations, people simply gathered wild wheat the way they gathered other edible plants, using simple stone tools to cut the stalks and grind the kernels between rocks. Archaeological sites like Abu Huraira in modern Syria show evidence of wild grain harvesting stretching back thousands of years before actual farming began. But something changed, gradually, almost invisibly, somewhere between 9600 and 7500 BC. People began doing more than gathering. They began replanting the seeds of the plants that produced the most grain, the ones that didn't scatter their seeds too easily, the ones that were, in a sense, easier for humans to harvest and control. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, and it's a detail worth sitting with. Wild wheat has a trait called a brittle rachis, meaning the seed head naturally shatters and scatters its seeds onto the ground when ripe, which is exactly how the plant spreads itself in nature. But a small number of mutant plants had a different trait, a tough rachis, meaning the seed head stayed intact instead of shattering. In the wild, this was actually a disadvantage for the plant, because its seeds couldn't scatter and grow on their own. But for a human harvester swinging a sickle, a tough rachis was a gift, because it meant you could cut the whole stalk and collect the grain without losing half of it to the wind. Early farmers, likely without understanding genetics at all, kept replanting the seeds from these easier-to-harvest plants. Generation after generation, they were unintentionally selecting for a trait that would have doomed the plant in nature but made it perfect for farming. Wheat didn't just get domesticated by humans. In a very real sense, wheat and humans domesticated each other. That idea might sound like a stretch, but archaeologists and geneticists studying Neolithic sites have found genuine evidence for it. As wheat became more dependent on human harvesting and replanting to survive and reproduce, humans became more dependent on wheat for a stable, storable food supply. Neither side could easily walk away from the arrangement anymore, and that mutual dependency changed everything about how people lived. Here's the pivot most people don't expect, and it's worth pausing on. Before wheat farming, humans had spent hundreds of thousands of years as mobile foragers, moving with the seasons, following game and wild plants. Farming wheat meant staying in one place, tending fields, waiting months for a harvest. It meant building permanent structures, storing surplus grain, and defending that surplus from other hungry people or animals. Some researchers argue that this transition, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, may have actually made early farmers less varied and their physical health worse in some measurable ways compared to hunter-gatherers, at least in the short term, even as it allowed populations to grow larger than foraging ever could. It's a genuinely debated point among historians and archaeologists, and it's worth saying plainly, the shift to farming wasn't a simple story of straightforward progress. It was a trade-off, and not everyone benefited from it equally or immediately. Still, the population math eventually favored the farmers. A patch of wild land might support a handful of foragers. That same patch of land, planted with wheat, could support many times that number, especially once people learned to store grain through the winter and lean seasons. Villages grew into towns. Towns needed organization, leadership, record-keeping. And this is where wheat's fingerprints start showing up in places you wouldn't expect, including, historians believe, the invention of writing itself. In ancient Sumer, around 2200 BC, in cities like Uruk, some of the earliest known writing wasn't poetry or religious scripture. It was counting. Clay tablets recorded quantities of grain, rations distributed to workers, debts owed and paid. Historians who study the origins of cuneiform script note that a significant portion of the earliest known written records relate directly to tracking harvests, storage and distribution of grain, wheat and barley among them. Civilization's first written words may well have been about counting bushels of wheat. That's a metaphor. That's a documented, if debated in its finer details, historical reality. Wheat's spread out of the Fertile Crescent wasn't instant, but it was remarkably fast by ancient standards. Within a few thousand years, wheat cultivation had moved into Anatolia, across the Aegean into Greece, along the Nile into Egypt, and eastward into the Indus Valley. Each region adapted wheat to its own climate and needs, developing different varieties suited to different soils and rainfall patterns. In Egypt, wheat farming along the predictable, nutrient-rich floods of the Nile became so productive that Egypt would later become known as one of the breadbaskets of the ancient Mediterranean world, its surplus grain feeding not just its own population, but eventually much of the Roman Empire. This is worth a moment of foreshadowing, because that dependency on Egyptian and North African grain would later become a genuine point of vulnerability for Rome, one that historians point to as a contributing factor in some of the empire's political and economic instability. An empire that outsources its bread supply to a handful of distant provinces is an empire with a very specific kind of exposed nerve. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the ancient world, wheat wasn't just food. It became deeply woven into religion, ritual, and daily identity in ways that are easy to overlook today. In ancient Egypt, the god Osiris was associated with grain and the cycle of death and rebirth tied to the agricultural calendar, the planting and harvesting of wheat mirroring stories of renewal. In ancient Greece, the goddess Demeter presided over the harvest, and the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of secret religious rites whose exact details historians still don't fully know, were closely tied to agricultural cycles and grain. Bread wasn't just sustenance, it was sacred. By the time we reached the Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, wheat had become something close to a political weapon. The famous phrase "bread and circuses," coined by the Roman satirist Juvenal around the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, wasn't really about bread as food. It was a biting critique of how Roman leaders used free grain distributions, along with entertainment, to keep the urban population docile and politically complacent. The Roman state actually ran a formal grain dole, known as the Cura Annonae, distributing subsidized or free wheat to citizens in Rome, a policy that historians estimate supported hundreds of thousands of people at its height. Whoever controlled the grain supply held enormous political power. Emperors stood this. Ambitious politicians understood this. A poor harvest in Egypt or North Africa could translate directly into unrest in the streets of Rome itself. And here's a mini-crisis worth sitting with. What happens to an empire that has built its political stability on the assumption that grain ships will keep arriving? Rome found out more than once. Disruptions to the grain supply, whether from bad harvests, piracy, or political instability in supplying provinces, could trigger real unrest among the Roman population, and historians have documented several instances of grain shortages contributing to political tension and even riots in the city. The bread that fed an empire could also, when it failed to arrive, threaten to unmake it. Wheat's journey didn't stop at the edges of the Roman world. As Rome's empire expanded, so did wheat cultivation, pushed into Gaul, into Britain, into parts of Germany, adapting slowly to cooler, wetter climates than the grain's original Middle Eastern home. When Rome eventually collapsed in the West in the 5th century, the elaborate infrastructure of large-scale grain trade collapsed with it in many regions, and Europe entered a long period where farming became more local, more small-scale, tied to individual manors and villages rather than empire-spanning supply chains. This is where we meet a genuinely dark chapter in wheat's history, one that's important not to sanitize. Medieval Europe was deeply dependent on cereal crops, wheat prominent among them, for basic survival, and that dependency came with real fragility. When harvests failed, and they periodically did, due to bad weather, plant disease, or war disrupting planting and harvesting seasons, famine could follow with devastating speed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, followed by several consecutive years of catastrophic rain and cold, is estimated by historians to have killed a significant percentage of the population in affected regions, a sobering reminder that a society's relationship with its staple grain was never guaranteed to be a happy one. Wheat had built civilizations. Wheat's failure could just as easily devastate them. There's a human story worth pausing on here, because it's easy to talk about medieval peasants as an abstract mass rather than individuals living through real hardship. Consider an ordinary farming family in 14th century England or France during those famine years, watching flooded by relentless rain, grain rotting before it could be harvested, and having to make impossible decisions about food, seed grain for next year's planting and survival, often with no good options available at all. These weren't distant statistics. They were people staring at empty granaries and uncertain futures, generation after generation, tied to a crop that could sustain them or fail them depending on factors entirely beyond their control. Despite these setbacks, wheat cultivation techniques kept slowly improving across the medieval and early modern periods. The adoption of the heavy moldboard plough, better suited to Northern Europe's dense clay soils than earlier Mediterranean-style ploughs, allowed farmers to cultivate land that had previously been difficult to work. The gradual spread of crop rotation systems, including the three-field system used widely by the medieval period, which alternated wheat, other grains, and fallow land, helped maintain soil fertility and increase yields over time. These weren't dramatic, single-moment breakthroughs. They were slow, accumulated improvements, the kind of history that doesn't make for flashy documentary footage, but genuinely changed how many people wheat farming could feed. Then came a turning point that would reshape wheat's global story entirely: European colonization and the age of transatlantic exploration, beginning in the late 15th century. Wheat, a grain that had never grown in the Americas before European contact, crossed the Atlantic Ocean along with colonizers, missionaries, and settlers. Historians sometimes to this broader exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New World as the Columbian Exchange, a term popularized by historian Alfred Crosby in the 1970s. Wheat took root in parts of Mexico, in the Spanish colonial territories, and eventually spread into what would become the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia, that would, centuries later, become some of the largest wheat-producing areas on the entire planet. Here's the irony worth sitting with, and one of the few times this story leans on that device. A grain that originated on a handful of specific hillsides in the Middle East, an area smaller than many modern countries, would eventually come to dominate agricultural landscapes on continents its earliest cultivators never knew existed. The wheat fields of Kansas, of the Canadian prairies, of the Argentine pampas, all trace their genetic and cultural lineage back to those wild grasses first gathered by Neolithic hands in the hills near the Tigris and Euphrates. But wheat's most dramatic modern turning point, the one that arguably saved more human lives than almost any single agricultural development in history, came in the 20th century, and it centers on one specific person, Norman Borlaug. Born in Iowa in 1914, Borlaug trained as a plant pathologist. Starting in the 1940s, began working in Mexico on a research program aimed at improving wheat yields and disease resistance. Mexico at the time was struggling with wheat shortages and crop losses from a fungal disease called stem rust, and Borlaug spent years in painstaking, often frustrating field research, crossbreeding wheat varieties to develop strains that were both disease-resistant and higher yielding. Here's the moment worth building tension around, because it's a genuine scientific breakthrough that doesn't get nearly enough attention outside agricultural history circles. Borlaug and his team developed semi-dwarf varieties, shorter-stemmed wheat plants that could support much heavier grain heads without collapsing under their own weight, a problem called lodging that had limited how much yield taller traditional wheat varieties could actually produce. These new varieties, combined with improved farming techniques and fertilizer use, dramatically increased wheat yields, first in Mexico, and then, starting in the 1960s, in India and Pakistan. Regions were facing serious concerns about famine and population growth, outpacing food production. The results were almost unbelievable at the time. Countries that agricultural experts had feared were on the brink of catastrophic famine instead saw wheat production increase dramatically within just a few growing seasons. This shift, which historians and agricultural scientists came to call the Green Revolution, is credited by many researchers with helping prevent famines that some demographers in the 1960s genuinely believed were imminent and unavoidable, particularly in South Asia. Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, one of the very few scientists to receive that particular honor, specifically for his work on increasing global food supply and its estimated role in preventing mass starvation. It's worth being honest here, in the spirit of not oversimplifying. The Green Revolution wasn't without genuine controversy and debate that continues among historians, economists, and agricultural scientists today. Critics have pointed to concerns about increased dependency on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, water usage pressures, and the economic displacement of smaller farmers who couldn't afford the new seeds and inputs as easily as larger operations could. These are legitimate, ongoing debates, not settled matters, and it would be dishonest to present the Green Revolution as an unambiguous triumph with no downsides at all. What's not seriously disputed is the scale of its impact on global wheat yields and its role in averting predicted famines during a period of rapid population growth. So where does that leave wheat today, in a world of industrial farming and global supply chains that would be utterly unrecognizable to a Neolithic farmer in the ancient Fertile Crescent? This is genuinely one of the most surprising parts of wheat's story, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Wheat is now grown on more land area than almost any other crop on Earth. It's estimated to provide roughly a fifth of the total calories and protein consumed by humans worldwide. A staggering figure for a single plant species, particularly considering that most of that consumption traces back to a domestication event that happened in one relatively small geographic region over 10,000 years ago. Modern wheat farming looks almost nothing like its ancient origins. Massive combine harvesters now cut, thresh, and separate grain in a single continuous pass across fields that can stretch for miles, work that would have taken entire ancient villages weeks of manual labor with sickles and threshing floors to accomplish. Genetic research on wheat continues today, including ongoing international efforts to sequence wheat's remarkably large and complex genome, work that scientists hope will help develop varieties more resistant to drought, disease, and the changing climate conditions that increasingly threaten crop stability worldwide. There's also a quieter, more sobering thread running through wheat's modern story, one worth acknowledging rather than glossing over. Global wheat markets remain genuinely vulnerable to disruption, a fact made starkly clear in recent years when conflict in major wheat-exporting regions like Ukraine and Russia caused real disruptions to global grain supplies and price spikes that affected food security in countries dependent on imported wheat, particularly across the Middle East and North Africa. It's a pattern that, if you squint, echoes something ancient Rome would have recognized instantly. Control over grain supply chains remains, even now, a source of genuine geopolitical leverage and vulnerability, just as it was when Roman emperors worried about ships from Egypt failing to arrive on schedule. And here's a detail that circles this story back in an unexpected way. Some researchers studying modern dietary health have pointed to rising rates of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease diagnoses in recent decades, though the exact causes behind this apparent increase remain genuinely debated among medical researchers, with theories ranging from changes in wheat breeding and processing to improved diagnostic awareness, rather than necessarily an increase in actual incidence. It's an area of ongoing scientific inquiry, not a settled conclusion, and it's worth resisting the urge to draw a tidy, dramatic narrative out of what remains a genuinely open medical and scientific question. So let's come back to where we started, that ancient granary standing between a farming village and starvation, all those thousands of years ago. What began as a handful of wild grass seeds gathered almost by accident on rocky hillsides became the invisible foundation underneath the rise of cities. The invention of writing, the wealth and vulnerability of empires, and eventually a scientific breakthrough that arguably saved more human lives in the 20th century than almost any single agricultural innovation before it. Wheat didn't feed humanity. In ways both wonderful and genuinely complicated, it shaped how humans chose to live at all, tying us to fields, to seasons, to the anxious hope that this year's harvest would be enough. It's strange to think that the loaf on your table, or the bowl of pasta, or the simple sandwich you might make without a second thought, carries within it a story stretching back over 10,000 years, through Sumerian tablets and Roman grain ships and famine-stricken medieval fields, and a quiet lab in Mexico where one scientist's persistence helped change the fate of entire nations. The grain hasn't changed as much as you might think. What changed was everything we built around it, believing all along that we were the ones in control. If this deep dive into the history hiding inside something as ordinary as wheat surprised you the way it surprised me researching it, let me know in the comments which everyday food you'd want uncovered next. Because there are histories like this hiding in almost everything on your plate. And if you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe, drop a like, and I'll see you in the next story.